Throughout the history of the Formula One World Championship, there has been an official change for the lead on the last lap of a race on only 28 occasions. Among those 28 occurrences, we have seen 24 different drivers take the lead on the last lap of the race. Considering those numbers, it's obviously something that happens very rarely, which makes two of these occurrences stand out. One of these last lap lead changes happened in 1970, and then another one happened just 4 races later the same year. The thing that makes this even stranger, though, is that not only did 2 last lap lead changes happen so closely together, but on both occasions they involved the same 2 drivers. Let's take a look at what happened. To start, let's first go back to 1968 to discuss the relationship between the 2 drivers we'll be talking about, which are Jack Brabham and Jochen Rindt. Brabham by this point was a long-established veteran who had won the World Championship 3 times and had been running his own team, while Rindt was still a relative newcomer on the scene, having made his debut in 1964. He had raced for Cooper for the previous 3 years, but in 1968 was hired by Brabham to be Jack's teammate for the season. Results were hard to come by for both drivers as the Brabhams were very unreliable, but despite this, Rindt enjoyed his time driving for Brabham and was interested in returning for 1969 when Brabham would get hold of the Ford Cosworth engine. However, Lotus, who had just won the championship in the hands of Graham Hill the previous year, was interested in Rindt as well and made a big offer to sign him. Rindt was still interested enough to re-sign with Brabham, though, that he supposedly offered to stay with the team for quite a bit less than what Lotus offered. Brabham wasn't able to offer half of what Lotus did, though, so Rindt was off to Lotus for 1969. Despite scoring his first win in 1969, Rindt still had reservations about driving for Lotus due to the fragility of their cars, along with some disagreements he had with Colin Chapman throughout the year, and expressed interest in returning to Brabham for 1970. The 2 reportedly had discussions about a reunion, and in Canada came to an agreement for Rindt to drive for Brabham in 1970. For Brabham, with Rindt back on the team, this meant that he would be able to retire from driving, much to the relief of his family. Lotus came back with a big offer again, which included the opportunity for Rindt to run his own Formula 2 team, and Rindt went back to Brabham and asked to be released from his deal, which Brabham agreed to, and Brabham decided to continue driving for 1 more season. Despite originally planning on not driving in 1970, Brabham won the season opener in South Africa, which was his first win since 1967, and then took pole at the next race in Spain, but retired midway through after running second for most of the way. As for Rindt, his season didn't get off to a great start, failing to score points in each of the first 2 races, but at the 3rd round in Monaco things would change. Lotus had debuted the Lotus 72, which would eventually become one of the most successful cars in Formula One history at Spain, but early on they ran into some teething issues with the car and showed up to Monaco with the previous model, the 49, which led to Rindt not being too hopeful of his chances for the weekend. Qualifying would not improve those hopes, as during the first session his engine blew, and he wasn't able to set a lap when the track was at its quickest, and in the final session he struggled to set a competitive time because of setup changes Lotus made on his car that didn't work. In between was a wet session, so he wasn't able to put a fast time there either. This meant that Rindt would start from 8th, almost 2 seconds off the pole which was set by Jackie Stewart, while Brabham would start a few places further up the grid in 4th. Stewart retained his lead at the start, while Brabham would gain a position to jump into 3rd, and Rindt would gain a place to move up to 7th, but would relinquish that place back to the matter of Henry Pescarolo on lap 3. Stewart would open up his lead early, while both Brabham and Rindt were running on the gearboxes of the cars ahead of them, but couldn't find a way by. After looking for many chances, Brabham finally made a move on Chris Amon to take 2nd on the end of lap 22 in the Gasworks hairpin, or the area that is now known as Rascasse. Just a few laps later, Brabham's fortunes got even better, as Stewart ran into some engine troubles which would eventually force him to retire from the race, which meant that Brabham would take the lead. At this point, Brabham was able to maintain a lead of a few seconds over Amon, while a bit further back, Rindt was running in 5th, having made up a few places from cars retiring, but was still stuck behind Pescarolo. He finally found a way by in the Gasworks hairpin on lap 36, and then it didn't take too much longer for him to overtake Danny Hulme to move up into the final podium position, although at this point he was still about 15 seconds off of Brabham's lead. Over the next 20 laps or so, the positions and gaps at the front remained stagnant, but in lap 61, Amon retired from the race with suspension troubles, promoting Rindt to second place in the 80-lap race. While Rindt had done a good job to make it up the second during the race, with 19 laps left, his gap behind Brabham was 13.5 seconds, so it looked unlikely that he would win unless Brabham ran into troubles. Brabham maintained the gap over Rindt, and even as late as lap 74, Brabham still held a 12.3 second lead. This is when things would start to change though. On lap 75, Rindt gained a second and a half, and then on lap 76 another 1.8 seconds to reduce the gap to 9 seconds. Then on lap 77, Brabham got held up by the lap car of Joe Siffert, costing him another 4.6 seconds, meaning Rindt closed just over half the gap on that lap alone. Rindt then gained another 2 seconds on lap 78, reducing Brabham's lead to 2.4 seconds. On lap 79, Brabham put in one of his fastest laps of the race, but Rindt still gained another 1.1 seconds. There is still just one lap to go though, and making up the final 1.3 seconds and overtaking Brabham would still be very difficult. As they came around to the Gasworks hairpin for the final time, Brabham still held about a second advantage, looking like he had done enough to hold on for the win, but still trying to make his way through a few lap cars, he decided to defend the inside line just in case. However, Brabham locked up and went straight into the barrier, allowing Rindt to take the hairpin as he normally would, taking the win in the final corner of the final lap. Brabham was still able to bring his car home and take second, but it was still a disappointing result in a race that he had a comfortable lead most of the way. The team said that Brabham was having troubles with his brakes, which caused him to lock up, but Brabham admitted that while the brakes were not at their best, it was still driver error that cost him the race. The race provided quite the dramatic ending, but as I said at the start, this wasn't the only time in 1970 these two would be involved in a last lap lead change. 4 races later at the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch, it looked like Lotus had figured out the problems with the 72, as Rindt had won the previous 2 races with the car, taking the lead of the championship. Brabham, on the other hand, failed to score points at the 2 races that followed Monaco, but did take a podium, finishing 3rd at the French Grand Prix that preceded the race at Brands Hatch. Rindt looked to be continuing with strong momentum from the previous races by setting a time nearly a second quicker than anyone else during the first qualifying session, but he ran into issues with his fuel tank at the second session and failed to set a competitive time. This left the door open for Brabham to match Rindt's times on the previous day, and the 2 drivers would start first and second in the race. At the start of the race, it was actually Jackie Ickx and his Ferrari who started 3rd that would take the lead into the first corner, with Brabham second and Rindt dropping to 3rd. Ickx quickly opened up a gap of a couple seconds, but at the beginning on lap 7, his differential failed. As he began slowing, Rindt pulled alongside Brabham as they entered the first corner Paddock Hill Bend and took what now became the lead of the race. Things wouldn't get easy for Rindt after he took the lead, as Brabham stayed right on the gearbox of the Lotus. Every lap the 2 drivers came around, they were nose to tail, with Brabham never falling more than a second and a half behind, and quite often the gap was about half a second. This lasted for about 60 laps, with the 2 drivers pulling away from the rest of the field. Finally, on lap 69 of the 80-lap race, the moment Brabham had been waiting for came. Rindt missed a gear change, which allowed Brabham to take the lead, and he immediately started pulling away, setting some of the fastest laps of the race. The laps ticked down, and by the time the last lap started, it looked like Brabham had the race won with a lead of about 13 seconds over Rindt. However, with 2 corners to go at Sterling's Bend, Brabham's engine started cutting out as he ran out of fuel, and Rindt came by to take the win from Brabham right at the end, just as he had done at Monaco. The drama wouldn't end there though. After the race, Rindt was initially disqualified due to some uncertainties over the height of his rear wing. Lotus protested the decision, and by the end of the evening, it was declared that Rindt's rear wing was indeed legal and he was reinstated the winner. This meant that Brabham lost 2 potential wins to Rindt right at the end of the last lap in the span of 5 races. To add even more insult to injury, back in March at the non-championship Race of Champions, which was also at Brands Hatch, Brabham lost a comfortable lead with 3 laps to go with reliability issues, although that time it was Jackie Stewart who benefited taking the win. Over the years, there is some uncertainty to how exactly Brabham ran out of fuel so close to the end of the race. It was known that sometime before the race that the engine was left in a rich setting, causing it to burn more fuel. Brabham would often blame future McLaren team principal Ron Dennis, who was a mechanic at Brabham at the time, and it caused the two to have a difficult relationship over the years. Over 30 years later, though, another mechanic with Brabham, Nick Guzzi, admitted it was his fault that the engine was left in the full rich setting. Another mechanic with the team, Peter Hennessy, tells a story in which she asked the car's designer Ron Toronak if they should put a bit of extra fuel in the car for the race, but was told not to by Toronak because he didn't want to add any extra weight in the car. Regardless how it all played out, the outcome was the same. A lost win for Brabham, along with 3 World Championship points. Up until this point, Brabham looked to be Rindt's main challenger for the championship, but the rest of the season would prove to be difficult for him, as his second place at Brands Hatch would be his last points of the year and the last points of his career, as he retired following the 1970 season. Rindt, on the other hand, would go on to win the next race in Germany, making it 4 wins in a row, but that would be the last win of his career, as he would tragically die in a crash during practice for the Italian Grand Prix later that year. The 45 points that Rindt had scored during the season up to that point was still enough for him to hold on to the championship lead by 5 points over Jackie Ickx to become the sport's only posthumous world champion. Had Rindt not taken those 2 wins from Brabham at Monaco and Brands Hatch right at the end, he would have finished with 6 fewer points, which would have been 1 less than Ickx, although Ickx did admit he was happy to not take the championship from Rindt under those circumstances. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you happen to have any memories of these 2 races or just Rindt and Brabham's career in general, I'd be happy to hear them. Or if you have any other comments, I'd be happy to hear those too. Thanks for watching.